This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 485 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Right now, FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to bet on any NBA or soccer game with reduced risk with their exclusive same-game parlay insurance. Simply place a 4-leg or more parlay to be eligible for the offer and follow along as the game unfolds. If exactly one leg loses, FanDuel will refund your bet up to $25 in site credit. So head to FanDuel Sportsbook and place your same-game parlay today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, Tennessee, Iowa, Virginia, and Michigan. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER in West Virginia. Visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. And in Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. It's a mailbag show, so let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from @Azon Frelly. Is it possible that high draft capital from a better performing organization, i.e. Ayuk to San Francisco, matters more than draft capital from a worse one? Cough, Henry Ruggs to the Raiders, cough. Or is it already captured in the general assessment of better environment? So I'm sure there's some argument to be made. Like if you're a wide receiver drafted by the Steelers, for instance. But there have been studies showing that the draft is largely random, that no team has this significant edge over another team. Now, maybe they do at certain positions. Maybe the Steelers actually do have an edge at wide receiver. The sample size just might not be large enough for us to conclude that. And I haven't done any work around this, and I haven't read anything on it. So if you've read something, definitely shoot me a link to that study. But with the example that you used with Ayuk versus Ruggs, I feel like it's coming from a place of looking at the result. Brandon Ayuk is the better wide receiver right now, and the way better dynasty asset based on what happened during that 2020 season. But Ruggs had the higher draft capital. So this question is almost phrased in a way where we're saying it's the Raiders' fault, as opposed to saying Henry Ruggs was just overvalued, and he would have been overvalued by more than just the Raiders. Because I think the latter is true. We know that teams liked Henry Ruggs. But like in my model, Henry Ruggs, despite his draft capital, he ranked in the 91st percentile as a prospect. Brandon Ayuk, who was drafted 12 picks after Henry Ruggs, he had a near identical percentile score. So what that tells you is that Ayuk was the better raw prospect according to my model. Ruggs just got boosted because of his draft capital. So I'm not sure the reason for something like this is organizational driven. It's going to be largely player driven. Ruggs could have easily gone to a better team organizationally and still have been drafted ahead of Brandon Ayuk. And he could have been just as bad of a fantasy asset to start his career. And maybe as a result of that, this question doesn't even get asked. It's just that they landed on these teams where one of those teams always seems to do the wrong thing, that being the Raiders. But no team is flawless in the draft. So draft capital, while it does matter, it's not everything. Especially when you're talking about 2 first-round picks. Now, if the question is asked more simply as, do organizations matter? Then I would say yeah. Intuitively, yes. If you're going to a school that has really crappy teachers versus a school that has really good teachers, you're going to be better off going to the school with really good teachers. So I'm sure it matters to some degree. I just have no idea how you'd really measure that given the factors that go into what makes a player good or not good. It's clearly not only the organization that makes a player good. The player himself has to be good. But sure, I think it's part of it. I think organizational structure matters. Now, I know that answer was kind of all over the place, but it's a really tough question to answer in a really direct and concise way, but I hope that it helps. The next question is another one about draft capital from @Gans_me that says, "Hi, appreciate your work. Thanks. For models that figure in where a player was selected in the draft, is there any way to control for the fact that one wide receiver class is particularly strong or loaded? Thinking about the 2020 wide receiver class and how day 3 wide receivers may have been day 2 picks in a weaker wide receiver year." So I've been asked this before because I talk about draft capital during the offseason on this show all the time, and I don't think it really matters. Like it might for some wide receivers at times, sure, but overall, I don't think this is that big of a deal. Like if a wide receiver draft class sucks, then they won't get picked early. It's not like teams totally force the issue based on need. Look at last year. Last year saw 6 first-round wide receivers and 7 second-round wide receivers. It was projected to be a good wide receiver class, and then draft capital backed that up. We clearly don't have 6 first-round wide receivers every single year to go along with 7 second-round wide receivers. That doesn't happen every single season. Those players were drafted higher because those players are good at football. They weren't drafted higher because of supply and demand. Honestly, if it were supply and demand related, you could make the argument that they should have been drafted later than they were, because there were lots of good wide receivers in that class, so teams didn't feel the need to reach. But really, based on draft capital, they did technically reach. Now, I understand what you're saying, that if a wide receiver class has like 50 good wide receivers and other classes typically have like 20 good wide receivers, then eventually players will get pushed back in drafts. And like I said, maybe that's true for a player or two. Like maybe Tyler Johnson would have been picked in the 4th round rather than the 5th round in any other draft class. But I think it's important to not exaggerate how that would change things. And then you have to think about the application of draft capital here too. We may have had a good idea that this wide receiver class from 2020, that it was going to be good. But that wasn't a guarantee. Just because players are drafted in certain spots doesn't guarantee they're going to be good. You would know after the fact, sure, but after the fact, it's too late. Because by that point in time, you've already seen them play in the NFL and you're not doing your rookie drafts. I just think something like this is probably overthinking it a bit. Like, yeah, maybe there's something there for specific wide receivers. But think of it this way. Let's say that you've got a 5th round wide receiver who hits, and he came from a really good draft class. Does that tell you that he would have been a 3rd round wide receiver if he was in a crappy draft class? In my opinion, it doesn't tell you that at all. But I don't think that would really tell you anything aside from the fact that teams missed out on a good player. The way you'd probably figure that out is by looking at good draft classes in the past and then seeing if those classes had a lot of good day 3 hits. And I can tell you that looking at the 2014 class, for instance, which is one of the best ones that we've seen, I'm not sure you have any sustainable wide receiver picks who came after pick 100. The best is like Quincy Enunwa or maybe Martavis Bryant. Now, I could be missing someone here because I just skimmed my database, but it's not like that really, really good wide receiver class had all these great day 3 wide receivers. And like last year, who was drafted after pick 100 that was only pushed down because of the depth of the class? Like, I hope to the fantasy football gods that Tyler Johnson becomes a thing, or that Quintez Cephas can ball out. But it's really Darnell Mooney that looks like a good hit, and that's it. Maybe others end up hitting, but let's not pretend that it's happening frequently. So no, I don't think the depth of a position going into a draft should alter how we view draft capital. This next question is from @Myron Isaacs. JJ, after listening to your 2021 pre-draft running back analysis, I wonder if you have an update on your 2020 pre/post-draft running back analysis with 2020 season hindsight. Did season results follow your model expectations? So I think one thing to remember is that my model is predicting the output for a player's first 3 years, not his first year. So technically, it's a little bit hard to answer this question. Now, with that being said, we can generally tell who's trending the right way. And so far, so good. I mentioned on the show earlier this week that 8 different running backs hit that 80th percentile mark in my model this past year. And they were all guys that you'd expect based on draft capital. They were the top 8 running backs drafted. So players like Zach Moss, Lynn Bowden, Darrington Evans, they went in round 3, but my model didn't have them hit that 80th percentile mark. And then if you look at last year's draft class, the only hit really outside of those players, outside of those day 1 and day 2 picks, was James Robinson. And I liked James Robinson despite the fact that he was undrafted. So overall, last year's looking really good. Aside from Keyshawn Vaughn, of course. This next one was a little bit long, so I had to shorten it, but it says, JJ, love the content as always, and I can't believe it's Dynasty rookie time already again. Thank you for the J-Rob help last year. Awesome hit. Thanks. I'm always looking for a late pick or undrafted rookie running back to stash. As you always advise, the upside is the pass catching ability with the right size. Now, I'm a Big Ten guy, and 2 running backs are being overlooked, likely due to limited production, but maybe to my gain. Michigan's Evans and Indiana's Scott are the 2, and they seem to profile as 3-down backs and deep prospects. Neil. So let's start with Chris Evans from Michigan. His numbers in my model, they're not great. His best season touchdown share was 20%, which if you listened to the show earlier this week, you would remember that that's significantly lower than the stud sample average, or what we see from successful NFL running backs. His best season reception share was fine enough at 8.7%, but he had a really, really bad best season yards per team play rate. It was under 1. That's one of the worst in the class. He does have good size, but there's not a whole lot analytically to like about him. Of course, anything can happen, but he's not someone who I'm prioritizing right now. With Stevie Scott, I think there's a little bit more there. I like Scott more than I like Evans. He's got a similar BMI as Evans, but his production was just stronger across the board. And he's got age on his side. Chris Evans definitely does not. If I were to place a bet, I'd say that neither guy is going to be really fantasy relevant at the next level. That's just based on their current profile. But of course, I'm always open to being wrong. And I recognize that there's tons and tons of variance here because prospecting is very hard. This next question is from @BobForrest3. Am I the only one who thinks Miles Sanders could bring league-winning value in all formats? Seems like he'll be a mid to late second round guy. I think anyone being drafted in the first or second or third round should be able to provide that kind of upside. If they can't, they're not worth drafting there. And Miles Sanders definitely has that upside, yes. I've mentioned before on this show that I don't think Doug Peterson being gone should necessarily make you like Miles Sanders more. Because Sanders' market share numbers last year when he was active, they were totally fine. I think you should like Sanders because he's good. And he's likely to have a big workload. And it was good to see him thrive down the stretch with Jalen Hurts under center. So no, you're not the only one. Anyone who's listened to this show knows that I love Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders has a ton of upside. I just wish that we could feel a little bit better and more secure about the environment of that Eagles offense. This next question is from @DLP Sports. Curious on your thoughts on DeAndre Swift. Similar to James Robinson, it wouldn't shock me if they add another guy to that running back room. That being said, Swift's role is more secure and safe, and they've been talking him up. I lean to the Swift takeover side, but curious where you value him. Yeah, I would lean that way as well. I do think from a rankings perspective that there shouldn't be such a gap between Swift and some of the other running backs from last year's class. But Swift is a great pass catcher, and I think that's what's going to separate him from a James Robinson type, who you referenced in this question. It's the fact that if they add another piece to that backfield, Swift's production is going to be less responsive to that piece because he's likely to be used heavily as a receiver. Or at least we should feel good about his use as a receiver from a projection standpoint. With someone like James Robinson, who obviously wasn't as highly touted coming out, you're worried about a player really digging into his workload. And it's a workload that is not very sustainable. What James Robinson did last year from a running back rush share standpoint, that is not going to happen this year. I would be incredibly shocked if it happened once again. But yeah, Swift is a great player, and I would be more than happy to have him on my fantasy rosters. The last question this week is from @CFGamebreaker. How much do you factor in things like team red zone pass to rush ratio, red zone completion percentage, etc. into your touchdown regression analysis? Specifically wondering about your Aaron Rodgers talk a few episodes ago. He was close to the top in red zone attempts and dominated red zone completion percentage. Yeah, I mean, look, I look at all of that. But the thing is, those things aren't ultra sticky year over year. How a player performs in the red zone one season doesn't mean he's automatically going to perform that well the next season. How a team ran plays from within the 5-yard line one year doesn't mean that they're going to run plays the same way from the 5 the next year. And honestly, Aaron Rodgers and what he did in 2020 is the perfect example. This past year, Green Bay was second in the NFL in pass to rush rate from within the 5. They had a 1.66 pass to rush attempt ratio. In 2019, their pass to rush ratio from within the 5 was 0.74. That ranked 20th. So in 2019, they were 20th in pass rate from within the 5. This past year, they were second. The correlation of pass to rush ratio year over year in that area of the field, it's pretty much non-existent across the league. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the number regresses, that we can't assume the Packers will be so pass heavy when they're that close to the end zone. And I'm specifically calling out that part of the red zone because Aaron Rodgers dominated there this year. It's a key reason he was able to rack up the touchdowns that he racked up. He threw 20 touchdowns from within the 5-yard line. The next closest players were Tom Brady, Josh Allen, and Russell Wilson. They had 14 touchdowns. My data that I compile references back to 2011, and Rodgers' 20 touchdowns from that area of the field, that's the highest that we've seen during that time frame. It's 2 touchdowns higher than the player in second, which is 2013's Peyton Manning. That was the season that Manning had 55 touchdowns. Guys, the key at winning in fantasy football is understanding that what mathematically happened before isn't automatically going to happen again. The key is understanding variance and that regression exists everywhere. Because once you can recognize that most stats in football are not that sticky year over year, once you recognize that, once you embrace that variance, you're able to easily pinpoint which players you want to target and which players you want to avoid during a draft. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.